My name is Sudeep Sen. I'm a poet, editor, photographer, and designer.
তীর নাই তোর কিনারা নাই রে, তীর নাই তোর কিনারা নাই রে, ভবের নাইরা রে, ছাইরা দে হাল তুইলা দে পাল, ভবন পারের নাইয়া.
I'm a poet, and I wrote my first poem probably when I was in class 10. So this was way back. But I read a lot of poetry, of course. I review poetry, other people's poetry. I teach poetry as part of literature courses, poetry workshops at universities in England and America and elsewhere in India. I have edited many anthologies, the last significant one being the Harper book of English poetry by Indians. So Indians who live in India as well as the wide Indian diaspora, including places which have been unmapped before, such as Fiji and East Africa and so on and so forth. Poetry, although it's the most important part of my life, happens to be one aspect of my life. So photography, I would say, is equally important. It's a parallel strain. But I don't think of my different interests in design, teaching, photography, visual art, graphic art as separate boxed entities. I mean, they sort of feed each other, even though I may have a parallel life as a photographer. I have a gallery in Berlin called Art Embassy. I show in art fairs, I sell my prints, I sell my photographs. It's another side of poetry. I mean, it's visual poetry. Poetry, in a sense, is for me life. It is what drives me, it's what I do. Everything else has to fit around poetry. It actually chose me. I really don't have a choice. It was embedded in my genetic system. This is one of those weird diseases I have and refuse to get cured. So I rejoice, I feel blessed, I feel very lucky that I've got poetry as a lifetime companion. I don't need anybody.
Kargil. 10 years on, I came searching for war signs of the past, expecting remnants, magazine debris, unexploded shells, shrapnel that mark bomb wounds. I came looking for ghosts, people past, skeletons charred, abandoned brick wood cement that once housed them. I could only find whispers among the clamor of a small town outpost in full throttle. Everyday chores sketching outward signs of normality and life. In that bustle, I spot war lines of a decade ago, though the storylines are kept buried, wrapped in old newsprint. There is order amid uneasiness. The muezzins cry, the monks chant, baritones merging in their separateness. At the bus station, black coughs of exhaust, smoke screens everything. The roads meet, and after the crossroad ritual diverge, skating along the undotted lines of control. A porous garland with cracked beads adorns Tiger Hill. Beyond the mountains are dark memories, and beyond them no one knows, and beyond them no one wants to know. Even the flight of birds that wing over their crests don't know which feathers to down. Chameleon-like, they fly, tracing perfect parabolas. I look up and calculate their exact arc, and find instead a flawed theorem.
The writing of poetry is, in a sense, quite miraculous. Very often it's driven by some sort of lightning bolt, which we would call inspiration. But that's just the starting point. The germ of the poem will be there. You still have to go out and get to your desk and write it out. The first draft, the second draft, the third draft. And for me, the best poetry happens when you balance your heart as well as your craft. So there's a lot you have to do once the poem is written and edited. Even after your final edits, balancing the cadence and texture takes a long time. I spend 2 hours every day with poetry. Of course, I can't write a new poem every day. I wish I could. But for me, that's the time. It's my meditative time. I would read other people's poetry. I'm often reviewing work. So there's always 2 hours in the day when I'm with poetry. And when I'm revising a manuscript for a book, of course, you're spending a lot more time because, you have a deadline and you sort of work with it. But the first flush is usually magical. Having said that, there are times I've written poems, you're commissioned to write on a particular subject, and that can be good or bad. It all. Then you're talking about craft, how skilled you are with words. Often people think that poems have to be these fantastic inspirational bolts, and they are. But you can also construct poetry and beautiful poetry. When it comes to studied rhythms, if you're talking about English verse, these of course you study, and once you study, it's fun to work within those structures. You may or may not write in it eventually or publish in those forms, but I think it's quite useful, just like mathematics, just like learning your multiplication tables. I think it's very useful to have all your tools in sharp order. You have to have the knives well sharpened, otherwise you can't do anything with blunt knives. It was always poetry that actually drew me. Most of my friends tend to be novelists, so I know what that life is like. And the better novelists, the more diligent novelists, wake up in the morning and sit at their desk, produce so many thousand words every day, and then it's like a job. For me, it's not as though I haven't tried fiction. I just find whenever I'm actually attempting fiction, why is it that I'm wasting so many words when I can actually get it down to a precise, short, distilled space in a poetic form? However, having said that, I do like non-fiction. So I like long essays, narrative essays, which is a very different kind of writing. But poetry, I don't have any of these issues. New poems come. I enjoy working with different forms. Devising new forms, breaking old traditional forms. So for me, it's a sort of a plasmic, ever-expanding thing, and I can see myself doing it, until eternity, really. I think the best poetry is poetry that works both on the page as well as when it's read out. I mean, to me, my ideal poem should be working both ways. Sometimes you find poetry which only works when you read it and falls apart when it's actually recited. And the other way around is more often true when you have poetry such as, protest poetry, rap poetry, reggae poetry, fantastic to perform and listen to. But if they're not written well enough, when you read them as script on the page, often it's, they fall apart. So for me, the best is if both can happen, because ultimately poetry also really needs to be heard, because it is the earliest form of literature. The first form of literature was oral poetry. The rhyme and rhythm was invented because it aided memory, and it was passed down from generation to generation, and we remember old poems by heart. Once the printed book happened, the types of reading changed. But poetry really, ideally, if you want to really enjoy poetry, it needs to be heard. And I actually read other people's poetry aloud to myself. I read it quietly first time around, but then the second and the third reading, I actually read it aloud. Because the sound is very important, as is the image and as are the words.
Winter. Couched on crimson cushions, pink bleeds gold, and red spills into one's heart. Broad leather keeps time, calibrating different hours in different zones, unaware of the grammar that makes sense. Only random woofs and snores of two distant dogs on a very cold night clears fog that is unresolved. New plants wait for new heat to grow, to mature. An old cane recliner contains poetry for peace, woven text keeping comfort in place. But it is the impatience of want that keeps equations unsolved. Heavy, translucent, vaporous, split red by mother tongues, winter's breath is pink.
The whole aspect of translation is very important. Let's face it, all 80% of my reading of world poetry is through translations. And ever since I've started translating, which is now, over a decade ago, I find that it has actually really enriched my English language writing. When it comes to my poetry being translated into other languages, of course I'm very thrilled, and the more languages it gets translated to, the more people will read it. So, on a personal level, I feel thrilled. I often find that the best translators of my poetry tend to be poets who know English and know the target language and the mother language. They don't have to be, but if they are poets themselves, they understand the sort of intricacy of cadence and texture and how a poem is actually born and constructed. So that helps a lot. But to me, the translation, if it can capture 80 to 90% of the original, I think I'm usually quite happy, because it's impossible to get 100%. To get 100%, you have to read the original language. That's 100%. Basic skeleton of a song is a poem, not poetry in a traditional way, but it is a poem. Lots of crossovers take place. I mean, I work a lot with musicians and dancers, for instance. I love it because the other artistic genres and art forms really, really inspire me. And I've grown up in a very, very holistic kind of family. To me, because everything is really part of a larger whole, things become meaningful. Moment we freeze poetry as high art, there's a problem. The idea is to be judicious but democratic, studied, at the same time spontaneous. In the HarperCollins Book of English Poetry, which I edited a couple of years ago, I provocatively said in the introduction that the best of English language poetry being written in India by Indians is far superior than the average fiction that is churned out. Really, really fine stuff going on. And in addition to, we are talking about, these are mainstream publishers and the second tier of publishers. Other than that, the spoken word scene has really, really flourished. There are lots of young groups, poetry groups, writing groups who meet. They perform in cafes and people's homes and restaurants. They have clubs that do it. It's really, really fantastic. And of course, internet. We forget that, Internet is one of the most democratic things. It's accessible to just about anybody who has some access to broadband. So often, again, a lot of poetry sites, good and bad, on the internet. So I think it's really, really flourishing. And I would say just read, go out and enjoy it, write it, go out and do it, enjoy it, live it.